welcome to Unsolved Edition. I am here yet again with a new seasonal video. The 12 Murders of Christmas. Christmas is about many things. Spending time with family and friends. Showing kindness to everyone around you, even the people who are strangers. If you're a spiritual person, perhaps you enjoy celebrating your religious beliefs with others who also share them. Nearly everyone has the day off and gets to relax. There's even food and presents. Christmas is the one day a year when people are mostly decent to each other. It's a special day when humanity proves that sometimes it's not all bad. At least on the surface, Christmas Day is just another day on the calendar, and bad things can happen to you at any time. There's a reason why emergency services don't get the day off, too. The world doesn't stop just because it's December 25th. Accidents happen, people get sick, and yes, crimes are committed. In fact, some incredibly horrifying crimes have been perpetrated during the holiday season. Story 1: The Lawson Family. On December 25, 1929, in Germantown, North Carolina, the Lawson family was having a peaceful Christmas. Charlie Lawson, a sharecropper, had gotten enough money together to take his wife and 7 children out to buy new clothes and even had family photos taken. A pretty good Christmas considering the Great Depression had begun earlier the same year. But then, something no one could have predicted happened. And historians and researchers still don't completely understand it. Charlie decided, for reasons unknown, to kill his entire family. He shot 2 of his younger daughters as they were leaving to visit their aunt and uncle, according to the Greensboro News and Record. He then shot his wife, who was sitting on the front porch, went inside and killed his oldest daughter and 2 younger sons, and finally murdered his infant daughter last. Afterward, he went into the nearby woods and died. You might have noticed Lawson only killed 6 of his 7 children. For equally mysterious reasons, Charlie sent his oldest son, Arthur, on an errand right before he began the killing. No motive was ever determined for the killing, nor were his reasons for sparing Arthur. One rumor alleges Charlie was assaulting his oldest daughter, Marie, and she was pregnant. Thus, he killed his family out of shame and guilt. This hasn't been proven, however, and Marie was not noted to be pregnant during her autopsy. Story 2: Alexis Valdez. Housing can be tough to find for a student, especially in the last several years. And while Christmas may be about goodwill toward those around you, sometimes a situation is simply not sustainable. This was the situation 18-year-old Alexis Valdez found himself in on Christmas Day, 2013. Valdez had been staying with his aunt and her boyfriend, Sylvester Diaz Hernandez, who allowed him to live in their apartment as long as he remained in school, worked, and helped out with the bills, according to CBS Chicago. At some point, though, Valdez quit school and his job and wasn't upholding his part of the bargain any longer. His aunt and her boyfriend decided to ask him to leave. It was bad timing, seeing as it was Christmas, but Valdez seemed to take it extra hard considering what happened next. He confronted his aunt's boyfriend, and things quickly turned violent. In his anger, Valdez killed Diaz Hernandez with a hammer, mutilated his body by removing all of his limbs, and then decapitated him, leaving his head in Valdez's aunt's bed. He later described this as a present. Valdez called the police and told them exactly what happened and fully admitted to the murder when police arrived. They found him covered in blood. Reportedly, Valdez later said he would have killed his aunt, too, had she been home. Story 3: Emma Calico. One of the most terrible crimes committed during the Christmas season didn't even happen in the 20th century. In the wee hours of Christmas Eve 1881, in Ashland, Kentucky, Emma Calico was staying with her friends and next-door neighbors, Robert and Fanny Gibbons, according to Sword and Scale. All 3 were young adults, still in their teens, and enjoyed one another's company. With Emma's mom just next door, it seemed like a perfectly safe night away from home. At some point between December 23rd and December 24th, though, something horrible happened. 3 men carrying axes burst into the home and savagely murdered the trio. As if that weren't enough, they set the house on fire, too. Emma Calico's mother saw the flames from next door and called for help. The axe-wielding men had fled, and in the remains of the fire, the townspeople found the charred bodies of Emma and the Gibbons. No definitive motive was ever discovered for the crime. But a man named George Ellis did confess, implicating his 2 partners, William Neal and Ellis Craft. All 3 were locked up in a secure location due to fears that a lynch mob might come and kill them. A year later, Neal and Craft were sentenced to hang and Ellis to life in prison. But this time, the lynch mob did come for Ellis, and he was killed the night of his conviction. Story 4: Carlo Mercado. Gianni Belvedere was talking to his cousin on the phone, waiting in the parking lot of a Macy's in Mission Valley, California. It was the early hours of Christmas Eve morning, 2013, and Gianni had come to pick up his fiancée, Ilona Flint, who worked there. At the time, Macy's was staying open extra late to cater to last-minute shoppers. As Gianni was waiting, a man approached, shot, and killed him, then stole his car, according to NBC San Diego. The man, Carlo Mercado, drove Gianni's car to his own house, even filling it with gas, but soon came back to Macy's for his motorcycle, which had broken down nearby. Once there, Mercado encountered Flint and Gianni's brother Sal, who were searching for him. They saw Gianni's car, but quickly realized it wasn't him driving. Mercado killed them both. Police later arrested Mercado and expected to hear some sort of explanation for the shootings, but there wasn't one. Mercado had never met them. There was a theory that Gianni's murder was tied to a road rage incident, but this was never confirmed and Mercado wouldn't comment. Authorities ended up declaring the killings a random act of violence. Story 5. The Ortega Family. There are a number of horror movies, often of questionable quality, set around Christmas time and featuring a killer in a Santa Claus outfit. But that's just fiction, right? Mostly, yes, but it has happened more than once, and not in a silly, over-the-top bit of B-horror way. On December 24, 2008, the Ortega family of Covina, California, was sitting down for Christmas Eve dinner and enjoying family time, according to Oxygen. That's when Bruce Pardo, the ex-husband of Sylvia Ortega, showed up. Pardo, wielding multiple firearms, immediately began firing at his former in-laws, all while dressed as Santa Claus. When he was done with this monstrous act, he used a homemade flamethrower to burn the Ortega's house to the ground. In all, 9 members of the Ortega family, including Pardo's ex-wife, were dead by gunshot or fire. Pardo died at his brother's home hours later. Story 6. Kashmir James. On December 25, 2010, in Los Angeles, California, a horror was unfolding. Kashmir James, a 25-year-old nurse, was visiting a friend for Christmas with her 3-year-old daughter Niva in tow, according to Weekly. After spending some time with loved ones, Kashmir and Niva got back into the car, with Niva placed in a car seat in the back. Kashmir was climbing into the driver's seat when 3 males pulled up next to her and murdered her in a drive-by shooting. Niva was unharmed but saw the whole thing. At a press conference where police announced a search for the killers, someone passed Niva a microphone, where she heartbreakingly asked the crowd to, "Please help mommy." Police did eventually track down the killers and brought them to justice, but what they found out in the process was even more terrible. The murderers were 16-year-olds participating in a gang killing, but that's not the horrifying part. They killed Kashmir James by mistake. They had misidentified her as their intended victim. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so a young child's mother was violently killed in front of her on Christmas, all based on mistaken identity and some very unfortunate timing. Story 7. Marvelous. Christmas Eve, 1992 was just the beginning of a multi-day crime spree committed in Dayton, Ohio, which included murder and robbery. Things started relatively small but quickly spiraled out of control until December 26, 1992, when the perpetrators were finally caught, according to the Dayton Daily News. It began with Marvelous Keene, 19, his girlfriend Laura Taylor, 16, and their friend Heather Matthews, 20. The 3 planned to rob an associate, Joseph Wilkerson. After breaking into Wilkerson's home and tying him up, Keene and Taylor found a gun in the home and used it to kill the man they were only there to rob. This was the inciting event that seemed to instill a bloodlust in the 3. They added DeMarcus Smith, 17, to their group and began killing strangers, such as Denita Gully, who was merely talking on a payphone when the group came across her and killed her in cold blood. Taylor and Matthews both called their ex-boyfriends, escalating to attacking people known to them. One was injured when Matthews shot him. The other was executed by Taylor while the man was driving, requiring Taylor to dive out of the moving vehicle before it crashed. The crew ended things by killing 2 friends who the group thought might implicate them. The 4 were apprehended the following morning, December 26. Taylor, Matthews, and Smith are serving life sentences. Keene was executed in 2009. He had no final words. Story 8. Robert Gene Simmons. On December 22, 1987, Dover, Arkansas resident Ronald Gene Simmons began making phone calls to his children, arranging for them to come visit him with their own families over the holidays. While this would be wholesome under ordinary circumstances, Simmons had something very disturbing in mind, according to All That's Interesting. Over the next several days, as his children and their families arrived at previously scheduled times, Simmons began methodically killing each group as they showed up. This bloody work took 4 days, and by December 26th, Simmons had killed 14 members of his own family, lining their bodies up in neat rows. One of his victims was a daughter he had sexually abused for years and had even given birth to a child sired by Simmons. This information becoming public is believed to have been a motivating factor in the crimes. On December 27th, Simmons merely sat at home, drinking beer and watching TV. December 28th saw him back at his rampage, though. He traveled to the nearby town of Russellville. He visited his old workplaces, killing 2 and wounding 4. He also stopped to murder a woman who had recently rejected his advances. At his last stop, Simmons simply sat and waited for police to arrive after his deeds, chatting with workers there. He was found guilty, sentenced to death, and executed by lethal injection less than 3 years later on June 25, 1990. Story 9. Melissa Young. For many who are fortunate enough to be on good terms with their neighbors, the holidays are a time to share family and cultural traditions. And let's be honest, who doesn't love to get a surprise tray of cookies? But in 2014, the BBC reported on a shocking escalation between neighbors in Edinburgh, Scotland. According to the BBC, 37-year-old Melissa Young approached her neighbor, 47-year-old Alan Williamson, with a Christmas present. Williamson was in her apartment when she offered him a pair of sneakers and a calendar. And when he refused the gift, she would later testify that she had been possessed by a heavenly spirit. It was the Archangel Michael who had entered her with a flash of light, she said. Then, she heard voices telling her that she needed to defeat the demon that had taken possession of Williamson. And while she admitted she had stabbed her neighbor 29 times, she also claimed abnormality of mind. Court documents revealed that Young had called emergency services while Williamson was still alive. He was recorded in the background of the call, pleading to be let out of her apartment. During the trial, Young was diagnosed with a mixed personality disorder that included emotionally unstable narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial traits, and schizophrenia. Her defense appealed her sentence of 20 years to life, and the appeal was refused. Story 10. The Hallaver Murders. The Christmas Eve 2002 murder of Jean Hallaver and her daughters, 20-year-old Victoria and 15-year-old Elizabeth, started with an arrest. According to the McShane firm, Jean's husband, Ernest Hallaver, had been arrested on charges of sexually assaulting his daughters. Released on $100,000 bail amid his defense attorney's promise that he wasn't a flight risk. He was also ordered to stay away from the family. But his brother, Scott, would later testify that he had driven Ernest to the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania home where his wife and daughters were living and stayed in the car while Ernest went into the house. Jean, Elizabeth, and Victoria were discovered in the home on Christmas Day, each killed by a single gunshot to the head. The prosecution testified that Ernest Hallaver had been afraid that his daughters were going to testify against him in the trial, resulting from their accusation that he had been sexually assaulting them for years. Brother Scott was found guilty of third-degree murder and sentenced to 12.5 to 25 years in prison, while Ernest was found guilty of murder and handed the death penalty. His execution has been repeatedly delayed. In 2012, Penn Live reported that he was asking to have the rape charges dismissed, and in 2021, documents were still being filed with the courts. Story 11. Tricia McCauley. Tricia McCauley was a longtime Washington, D.C. resident, and her friend, Kate Debelak, described her like this: "She is one of the kindest and most gentle people that I know. So to think that someone could have harmed her is awful." It was her friends that first knew something was very wrong, and they reported her missing when she didn't show up to a Christmas party. After several days of searching, the BBC reports that her car was discovered where it had been parked on a D.C. street, with her body inside. A canvass of the area and a confrontation at a CVS led to police seizing the keys to the car and some of her credit cards from a man named Dwayne Adrian Johnson, who later claimed that he had picked McCauley up, engaged in consensual sex, then alleged that she had decided to die by S. Johnson added that he had continued to drive around with her in the back seat because he thought she was asleep. In November 2017, the Washington Post reported that Johnson ultimately admitted to killing McCauley after randomly running into her on the street, then beating and her. While his attorneys argued for leniency based on addiction and a history of mental illness, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Story 12. The Carnation Murders. When it comes to these murders, the events of the 2007 crime itself weren't argued at the trial, says Fox News. There was less of a question of guilt and more of a question of exactly what to do with the two people convicted of the horrendous Christmas Eve murders that took place in Carnation, Washington. According to what was presented at the trial, Michelle Anderson and her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe, plead guilty to the 8-hour series of events that left 6 of her family dead. The first victims were her parents, Wayne and Judy, who were killed inside their home before being dragged outside. Then, Anderson and McEnroe waited for the arrival of her brother, Scott, his wife, Erica, and their children, 3-year-old Nathan and 5-year-old Olivia. Erica survived long enough to call 911. When it came time to present a motive, prosecutors said that it was jealousy. They presented Anderson as unhappy and jealous of her brother's family and felt that she had been cheated out of money. McEnroe testified, "She treated me like an attacked dog, a guard dog," and recounted the scene. "It's smoky, it smelled of blood and death." McEnroe and Anderson were both sentenced to 6 life terms without parole. If you liked this video, or you want to add something that I missed, feel free to let me know in the comments section. Also, subscribe to our channel if you want to know more about similar unsolved cases.